Well, you know what I always say. Why have a conversation when you could show a PowerPoint? Just kidding. First of all, thanks to everyone for still being here. It's a little ironic for us to be talking about leisure time and short working hours and so forth at the end of this 3 days of intense conference, but it's been really great, and I really appreciate those of you who are still here. So I'm going to talk fast because we're just going to speak for a few minutes before we do the conversation. John and I decided to divvy up the topic. So I'm going to talk about time and self-provisioning, and he's going to talk about time and happiness, and we're going to hopefully together make the case that time is really central to all the issues that we've been talking about over the last few days. So I just thought I'd start by reminding us a little bit about the trajectory that the United States economy has been on for a long time. These are trends in working hours in a series of wealthy economies. The U.S. is that lightest blue line in the middle there. And what you can see from that is, in contrast to every other one of these economies, hours measured on an employment basis, so these are hours that are reported by employers, haven't fallen at all in the U.S., particularly since 1980. There was a little bit of a decline in this measure in the 1970s, but pretty much a flat line, so that none of the phenomenal levels of productivity growth that have been generated in this economy have gone towards reducing hours. They've all gone toward higher levels of output. If you measure this on a household basis or a per person basis, so asking individuals rather than employers, there's actually a quite significant increase in annual hours of work, something I've written a lot about. Here we can look at this data in relationship to productivity. And that's really important, because thinking about the issue of sustainability over the longer term, in order to get a sustainable economy, you're going to have to channel a significant amount of your productivity growth, assuming you have it, into shorter hours of work rather than increases in the size of the economy. This is one of the messages of John Fullerton's talk this morning, the idea of limits to growth. And what you can see by looking at that last column there, which is the decrease in hours as a percentage of productivity gains, is that the United States is way below all of these other countries. We have a lot of people from the UK here. You're marginally better than we are, but considerably below a number of the continental countries in terms of how much productivity growth is being turned into shorter hours of work rather than used to increase output. I can't help, of course, just noticing what's going on in Italy. We have a number of Italians here, but you can sometimes take these things too far. So the Italians have continued to reduce working hours without any increase in productivity. And so you see, I think that is one of the underlying issues that's going on in their economy at the moment. But in the earlier period, Italy was on a more sustainable path with respect to this relationship. So why is this so important? The big picture is, in my view, if you want a sustainable economy, you can't achieve it by trying to focus on consumption after people have gotten increases in income. They're just going to spend them, and you can, do all the behavioral programs you want and the exhortation and all of that, and it's really not going to amount to very much unless you control the path of income through the system. So if there's increased purchasing power being put into people's pockets, there's a really high likelihood it's going to be spent. So the key to, I think, we got feedback there? Okay, the key to, or a key to sustainability with respect to consumption is altering that path. So taking that productivity growth in the form of shorter hours of work rather than putting it back into the system as increased purchasing power. And with my, I'm sorry, when I put this on a PC, so now the margins are messed up and I didn't have time to switch this. We had just got the computer at the last minute. There's a recent paper I've done, which is coming out in Global Environmental Change with Kyle Knight and Jean Rosa, in which we show, with a sample of 27 wealthy countries, high hours countries have high eco-footprints, they have high carbon footprints, and they have high carbon emissions, and the reverse is true, that the low-hour countries are much lower on all of those. And scale, which is the issue I've been talking about, is really key here. If you have, say, fixed hours of work and you have productivity growth, which virtually all of these economies do, that productivity growth will go into rising output and consumption, and then you've got to just rely on technological change to get reduced eco-impact. If you allow hours of work to fall, you pull out some of that demand, and you're able to get a much bigger eco-impact. I want to say one more thing on this coming out of the morning's session, which was the question of, well, if we could just reduce consumption as a fraction of GDP, won't we be better off? 70% of our GDP goes to consumption. I think the answer to that is no, because that 70% it's a proportion of total output. Now, if you have a decline in output, you get better eco outcomes, especially on things like carbon, all things equal. If you just switch from consumption to investment, you may or may not get better ecological outcomes. It depends on the kind of investment it is, because that investment turns into tomorrow's consumption. Really important. So really the question is, what are you investing in, and also what is the government doing? If the government is doing military spending, that's really high impact. It could be doing, community energy, alternative energy or renewable energy stuff. So that proportion between consumption and investment, what happens today is not the end of the story, because investment today is consumption tomorrow. So in True Wealth, my most recent book, I talked about self-provisioning, and I'm now going to segue into self-provisioning. And the reason I talked about it was, a core of the message was, we need shorter hours of work. Well, if you're on a declining hours trajectory and you're taking your productivity growth and giving people more time, you're not giving them more income. What's happening on the consumption side? How are they living? How are they going to cope with stagnant incomes, for example? One answer to that is increased self-provisioning, so allowing people to get access to goods and services through things that they do themselves, and in that way they need less in the way of income, and a failure of income to grow is more it's more feasible for households. And in that book, so self-provisioning to replace income growth that is absent when productivity growth is used. So in that I talked about things like permaculture and the people food provisioning. I talked about urban homesteading, small-scale micro-generation of energy, home building, and all of the kind of interesting regional home residential construction activities that are going on now with eco-materials, fab labs, and so forth. But this is only one part of the picture. I'm now studying through the grant with the MacArthur Foundation what I've called connected consumption. It's also known as collaborative consumption, or the term I even like best is the sharing economy, because there's production and consumption going on at the same time. Someone made that point earlier. So it's the sharing economy, which is enabling a short hour sustainable economy with new forms of self-provisioning. And I just want to say a couple of words about this kind of self-provisioning. Basically, think of it as peer-to-peer activities. This is an old form of it. This is an offline tool library. They were popular, particularly in African American communities, started in the 20th century. because people did a lot of their own work at home and on their land and on their houses, but tools are expensive, so they often developed informally. But the new sharing economy involves much more technologically sophisticated goods like cars, and it's also digitally enabled. And it's happening in large part through digital platforms rather than local connection. There's still that local connection work going on, and we've learned about quite a bit of that at the conference in the last couple of days. The importance of the so what do I mean by the sharing economy? It's peer-to-peer, so that the producers and consumers are coming together as peers without the intermediaries of firms, although in some cases, in many of these cases, there are firms that provide the platforms, but the actual economic exchanges are peer-to-peer. They may be exchanging used goods. They may be sharing what the discourse calls idle capacity and assets, so a car that isn't being used all the time, housing, something like Airbnb. We were just talking about, folks here in the audience are going to be staying tonight in Airbnb lodgings, couch surfing, sharing finance, and we've talked about crowdfunding or crowdsourced funding, service bartering like time banking. There's a wide range of characteristics of these platforms in the economy now. Some are nonprofits who have mostly a social objectives. There are for-profit companies that are doing these. There are monetized versions of sharing, non-monetized. There are gift economies, there are exchange economies. It's a wide variety, and one of the things we're interested in this project is sort of what is the difference among some of those. So couch surfing, Airbnb, something which has absolutely taken off after it got venture capital financing. So you've got over 5 million nights booked by January 2012. Free Cycle, which is a gift economy. Here's a kind of yuppier version of Free Cycle, which is Yerdle, started by an advertising executive, former environmentalist. Time banks, fastest growing form of transportation in the world, bike sharing, and we have that nice bike sharing canopy downstairs. Transportation sector has a wide variety of sharing platforms, both car sharing, ride sharing, and what we call peer-to-peer car rental, in which people rent their cars out to others. Sharing money, Kickstarter, here's the expansion of crowdfunding. And some of the research that I've been doing most recently, and I've done case studies on some of those platforms that we just went through, is sharing economy platforms that allow people to earn cash. So these tend to be more in the for-profit world, so unlike a time bank, which is just a service barter arrangement, a multilateral barter arrangement, you have companies, platforms like TaskRabbit, which it's a sort of concierge service or an errand running service. People who have things they want done go on to TaskRabbit and post the things they want done, and the people who are interested in doing things for other people bid on those tasks. So it's actually a pure auction market, which has interesting and complex, or from our point of view, complicated economics. So this is a TaskRabbit platform. Here's someone who's going to be, doing cleaning. Here you can see someone's looking for accounting help, the description of the task. Shana writes in and says, well, how many receipts do you need organized? And Mark writes back, for 12 months he has not done his receipts for his job, so he's got a lot of expenses built up. It's a daunting task for him. He hires Shana, who does it for him. And here's an infographic on TaskRabbit. There are now 1,500 rabbits, a very demeaning term, but 1,500 rabbits, some of whom have PhDs, with apologies to those of you in the audience. No, and so TaskRabbit is one example of a sharing economy platform that allows people to earn money, and that I think there's a part of this infographic, top earnings in a month, $5,000. So although the people we're interviewing who are TaskRabbits are not earning those levels of income, they are able to earn significant levels of income, some of them to supplement other things that they're doing, and some of them are doing it more or less full-time. Here's relay rides. Here you're renting out your car, you're telling about the car, and now John G. wants to rent his car. And this is a really important part of this economy. There are ratings and reviews on these sites, because what this technology does is it allows sharing between strangers. If you think about the sharing economies of the past, they are typically sharing among people who know each other, and therefore trust and reputation issues are more or less solved through that, or they're smaller communities. Those tool libraries I talked about, those tools are going to be lent out to people who live in that community, who can be held accountable if they don't bring the tools back, and so forth. When you start sharing with strangers, you let them into your home, you let them drive your car, you let them watch your children, all of these things, it's a very different situation. So how can you make this work? You need to have information about the trustworthiness, the reputations, and so forth, and that's what the sort of the wiki process of rating does, is it enable these platforms to work, not perfectly, lots of issues around that, but it enables them to create sharing relationships among strangers, and that's really key. And then the last one is the Airbnb that I talked about. Picture of the place, and now here are the ratings. They're great hosts, nice location, here's the pictures, and so forth. So the thing I want to end on is the point that new technologies, and I really want to stress this point, I think that a sustainable economy, a new economy, a sustainable consumption system, if it's going to expand and if it's going to work, is going to have new technologies at its core. And those new technologies make possible new social and economic arrangements, which are efficient economically, which bring people together socially because they create networks and connections which didn't exist before. And they make possible some of the kinds of socialistic and social sharing that those of us who have argued against mainstream economics from a more progressive point of view have been, arguing for years. We're now in a technological age that I think really facilitates a lot of these kinds of sharing and cooperative relationships that we've been arguing for. Not to say that the technology is determinative. It isn't, because the technologies can be used by people who use it for very different purposes to amass profit and surplus and undermine that solidaristic and more communal kinds of dimensions of it. But if we're able to keep control of it, I think it does create those possibilities. And to bring us back to time, these technologies create new earning opportunities that are facilitated by short hours, that are facilitated by shorter hours and formal work. So you can combine a part-time job with earning some money as a TaskRabbit, renting your car, in a time bank, in a food swap, volunteering and getting goods in return for that in a kind of barter relationship. All of those things make possible a much more variegated set of streams of income and access to goods and services. A concept of diverse livelihoods, which I think is much more appropriate to a short hours regime than the sort of full-time, long hours employment model that I don't think remains realistic either from an economic or from a an ecological point of view. And I think that was my last, final. There are a lot of questions about this. I don't want to gloss over them. A lot of the research that I've been doing has been looking at the ways in which inequality is reinscribed, even in the most egalitarian and sort of sharing and non-monetized and non-profity kind of progressive versions of these, like time banks. There are questions about how much social capital they really build, and then this last point that I made, which is how much can they really do what I've been arguing, I think they have some potential for, which is to create a viable and attractive alternative to full employment. Thank you.
Well, hi, we were told at one point we might even not have PowerPoint. I don't know how to get this one to the full screen. I'm sorry. Great, okay. But we do. Otherwise I was going to use my joke, but I'll use it anyway. I was told once that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So you've probably heard that one before too. But before I talk a little bit about time, and I'm glad that Juliet has done me the favor of giving you all the statistics and things, so I won't have to do any of that, I want to mention where this comes from for me, why I think all of this is so important, why I care about it, and it really comes back to my experiences with a gentleman that I consider my personal hero. He's a fellow, you may have heard his name, David Brower. He built the Sierra Club into a major conservation organization in the United States, founded the international organization Friends of the Earth, and was perhaps the most effective U.S. environmentalist of the 20th century. But in his later years, David Brower used to go around the country giving what he called his sermon. And in his sermon, and I will do it for you, he took a while to do it, but I'm going to do it for you in about a minute, he compressed the age of the earth, some 4.6 billion years, into a week, kind of the biblical week of creation. And if you do that, you can see that a day makes up about 650 million years, an hour is 27 million years, a minute is 450,000 years, and a second is 7,500 years. Now, Brower said that if you look at that also, you find that the dinosaurs appear on the planet about 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning on the final day of the week, Saturday. Life starts on Tuesday. It becomes much more complex and beautiful over the intervening days, and on Saturday at 10, these big reptiles come on the scene, the dinosaurs. They have a long run. They last until 3 o'clock in the afternoon on that final day, but it is not until 3 minutes before midnight on the final day that we, Homo sapiens, human beings, arrive on the planet. Buddha shows up about a third of a second before midnight, Christ about a quarter of a second before midnight on the final night, and the Industrial Revolution begins at about 1/25th of a second before midnight, again on that final night of the week. And then finally, this consumer society that we have been a part of, the society of stuff, since World War II, occurs about 1/100th of a second before midnight on the final night of the week. In that 1/100th of a second, we human beings have managed to use more resources than all human beings who ever lived before that time all put together. We have reduced our soils, our fisheries, our fossil fuels, and God knows what else by something like a half. We have driven countless species into extinction, and we are rapidly changing the climate. And Brower said, you can't really grow on like this. He said, there are people who believe that what we have been doing for that last 100th of a second can go on indefinitely. But think about it. They are considered reasonable, normal, intelligent people. In fact, they run our corporations, they run our government, but in reality, they are stark, raving mad. Just think about what a short span we have used this by, and you understand that things have got to change. Now, what is the political dialogue like today in Europe and in the United States? It's really austerity versus growth, austerity versus stimulus. I would argue that these are really two sides to the same counterfeit coin, because they don't ask the questions, the important questions: austerity for whom? Austerity for the poor who have already experienced increasing austerity, whose budgets are being cut, or austerity for those who have piled up resources and income beyond anything ever known in previous history. That ought to be a question. And then finally, growth of what? What's going to grow, and what in fact must shrink if we're to stay within the planetary boundaries of the Earth. And one thing I think we agree on that we want to have grow is access to employment for people. We know that high levels of unemployment are bad for happiness, they're bad for many, many things. But how do we get there in a good way? Well, the little country of Bhutan has taken on this whole issue in a very big way. They have decided to challenge this whole concept of unlimited growth in the GDP, or the gross national product, or the gross domestic product. And they have done so through an idea they call GNH, or gross national happiness. Back in 1972, when Bhutan's 16-year-old king was coronated upon the death of his father, he was asked by an Australian reporter, "What are you going to do, king, to increase your country's gross national product?" And he said, "Well, with all due respect, sir, we believe that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product." And in the United States, we probably would have smiled at most, and maybe at worst called for the fellows to come in the white coats, but we would have quickly gotten back to the real business, the business of making money. Bhutan didn't do that. They, in fact, took their king very seriously, and over the next 40 years brought experts from all kinds of fields to look at how do you actually do gross national happiness? How do you measure it? How do you make it part of your country? And they found that happiness depends on essentially 9 key domains of life. Living standards, money is one of them, but it's only one. It's the one we pay all the attention to. Physical health, essential. Mental health. Community vitality, which is social connection and participation in community and trust in community, hugely important. Cultural vitality, not only the maintenance of and continuation of people's traditional cultures, but also access to arts and arts and music and so forth. Governance, democratic governance. And when the king found out that democratic governance mattered, he abdicated and turned Bhutan into a democratic republic. Education, of course, environment, and also access to nature, the importance of green space and all of those things. And then the one that Juliet and I have talked a lot about, time balance. And I was very surprised to see that this was part of Bhutan's GNH, but they recognize how important this is. Now, we in the United States who have been working with this in a project called the Happiness Initiative, and if you want to find out more about that, you can go to happycounts, happycounts.org, and you can take a 12 to 15 minute survey which will measure how well you're doing in each one of these domains. And we added work satisfaction because Gallup pointed out to us how important that is for well-being in this country. But you can do that. I think you'll have fun with it. We have colleges around the country where whole colleges are using the survey to see how they're doing with faculty, staff, students. We have communities doing this and so forth. One thing we find is we've had 40,000 Americans and people from many other countries take the survey, and the lowest scores very consistently have been in this area of time balance. And so that's something that I've been working on for a long time with an organization called Take Back Your Time around issues like family leave, which we are one of only 4 countries in the world that do not mandate at least paid maternity leave. The other 3, Swaziland, Liberia, and Papua New Guinea. sick leave, which almost every other country guarantees paid sick leave for workers, and vacation time, of which the United States is one of only 5 countries in the entire world that do not mandate any paid vacation time for workers, the other 4 being Suriname, Guyana, Nepal, and that paragon of human rights, Burma. That's it. So we have began to propose that we have 30% of American workers today who receive 0 paid vacation. I know those of you who come from Europe and other places must be shocked to know that most Americans don't even get the 2 weeks that we talk about. So we proposed one bill in Congress. In fact, President Taft, a conservative Republican, declared back in 1910 that Americans should have 3 months of vacation time, for example. We proposed a moderate bill in the U.S. House of Representatives which would have given people 1 to 2 weeks guaranteed paid time off. You would have thought we were proposing the end of Western civilization as we know it. The declarations were, what will this do to the economy? How can we possibly compete in the global economy if we give people 2 weeks off? Oh my God. And you have to point out that all of our competitors give people way more. I was on the Fox News program, and if you're from Europe, you may know about Fox News. Maybe you don't, but we Americans certainly do. Before I bash Fox News, and I fully intend to bash them, I want to say that they were the only major network that covered the issue at all. But I was on the Neil Cavuto program, and I was in his studio, and he was in New York, and he points at me through the screen, and he says, You want to turn America into a 21st century France. Can you imagine? As if we were going to force everyone to appreciate good food and wine. But I mean, this is the nature of this. Well, the other thing that we consider important is shorter work weeks and shorter work time in that regard. And we have some experience to show that people actually like them, although they don't advocate for them, and they sometimes resist them when they're imposed on them. So the best story of this is the Amador County experience, a small county in California, where in 2009, the workers had their hours, the county workers, cut by 4 hours a week, 10%. They went to 4 9-hour work days instead of 5 8-hour days, and their salaries was also cut by 10%. The first reaction of the workers to that was, we can't possibly stand this. This is horrible. They were out in the streets, they were protesting and so forth, because people really believe that what will make them happier is more money, and that's essential. 2 years later, the same workers were allowed to vote on whether they wanted to continue this 4-day week at 9 hours a day or increase their work week to full-time and have their salary raised to full-time salary. And I am happy to say that the workers in this small, very conservative county in California voted 71% to 29% to stick with the shorter work week with less pay, because they came to understand that this mattered to them. Now, hopefully we don't have to force this, and we have some good experiences that we don't have to, and the best one is the Hours Adjustment Act in the Netherlands, which allows people to really choose the number of hours they work, reduce their hours, have their benefits reduced by also prorated and so forth, but keep their health care. One of the effects of this is that we find that the world's happiest countries, according to Gallup, the World Values Surveys, and so forth, are also countries that have the shortest work hours in the world. And so we see among them, and you can look at the UN's World Happiness Report for a whole list of all of this, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Netherlands, and Norway being the top 5. And then UNICEF has just recently issued a report on the well-being of children in rich countries, looking at 29 countries. The number 1 country, the Netherlands, for children, and that's because Dutch parents actually have the most time to spend with their kids, and their kids also subjectively rated themselves number 1. The United States ranked number 26 out of 29, with only Latvia, Lithuania, and Romania below us. So I'm going to pass over this, but I think we need to also educate for leisure. That's something that matters, because there's always the concern that people will use leisure time simply in more consumptive things, although they won't have as much money, which makes it a bit difficult. Now, what do we want? Well, I want to take you on a quick journey about an hour from here, basically, according to MapQuest, 51 miles exactly and 60 minutes of driving time, to a town in Massachusetts called Lawrence, where a little over 100 years ago, in January of 1912, thousands of workers poured out of the textile mills of that town, most of them women and most of them immigrants, to demand a raise in pay from 16 to 18 cents an hour and a reduction of their working hours from 56 to 54 a week. And the story goes, and it's possibly apocalyptic, but the story goes that as they marched in the wintry streets of Lawrence, these women carried in front of them a banner which read, "We want bread and roses too." And the bread was the symbol of higher wages, and they needed it. It meant 4 loaves of bread a week for these very poor women. They needed it. But as poor as they were, they also understood that you don't live on bread alone, and that life is really about all these other things, art and love and beauty, the things in the words of the labor song about this that their drudging spirits never knew. They understood this, and they stood for it. And I think what has happened in a sense is that since World War II, we've forgotten that we need time, that we need to smell the roses, that we need all of that. We've allowed the roses to wilt, and I think it's time that we begin to water the roses again. So my final statement, we've talked, in the United States we have a thing called a tea party. You've heard about that. We also have a coffee party, which is a sort of liberal democratic version of the Tea Party. But my friend Cecile Andrews says that we've got to slow down, and what we really need is a decaf party to do all that. And final words from Conrad Schmidt of the Work Less Party of British Columbia: workers of the world, relax. Thank you.
I would thank you very much for your introductions. As we don't have a lot of time, I would like to open the floor immediately for questions, comments, and then we will hear from the panel. So I will take 2 or 3 questions, and then we will start a conversation. Who wants to start?
Is it possible that there's something built into American culture that resists the idea of leisure at a level significantly higher than what exists today? I mean, for example, historically, one thinks of Americans as people who left their homes, usually voluntarily, but made a choice. They were big risk takers. They're the kinds of people who, you know, everything from leaving pogroms in Russia to getting on boats in Haiti, and these are the shakers and movers. These are the people who, you know, who really want to make something happen. And that the culture here as a result of that kind of history is one that would never be one that would adjust to greater leisure time. And that it would be very difficult to change that kind of paradigm in this country uniquely.
Thank you. I will take 1 or 2 more. Nobody? Ethan.
I'm just wondering, I actually have a couple questions. Well, let me ask, there's different kinds of jobs, and then there's vocations, because it kind of occurs to me a lot of the people working for more leisure time and reduced hours are probably working long hours themselves at various professions, but these are kind of vocations that are kind of life passions. But then there are jobs like factory work that are more a job, and then people go home and live their real lives. So, you know, I'm wondering if you could comment on the overlap between work and passions versus the other kind of work.
Thank you. 1 more?
So, listening to this presentation, I was reminded by a study out of Yale. Dan Cahan and his group, they had a study about, can you hear me? Okay, slowly, I'll speak slowly. So, there was a study looking at how people perceived climate change. And in this study, I think they established that conservatives were against the idea of supporting climate legislation because they felt it went against the industriousness, right? And a desire for work and creation. And in some sense, what you're talking about goes very much, it's even more blatantly, perhaps anti-industrious in some ways. So how is this message going to be kind of mainstreamed and not become another subculture where, you have crunchy hipsters in Oakland sharing stuff?
Thank you.
Start.
Okay.
Go ahead. Did you say you want to start? Yeah.
I said you
Who
can.
wants to talk first?
Let me try to give, I don't know the answer to that. I don't have an easy answer to the third question, but let me give very quick answers to the first two. Number one, really, are we in love with work? And that's partly the second question too in the United States. Are we so trapped in that? Well, we like to say we are, and there's a sense that we are, but we have to remember that we in the United States were actually the first country that was pushing hard for the shortening of work hours. The whole idea of May Day started when workers in the United States in 1886, in cities all over the country, led the first protests for the 8-hour day, for example. And we actually worked fewer hours than Europeans worked until the early 1970s. So, secondly, Gallup does a daily poll. And it's a good thing you're all sitting down, because you're going to be shocked at this, but Gallup polls Americans each day about how happy they are, 1,000 Americans. And are you ready for this? Gallup finds that Americans are 20% happier on weekends than on work days, and 30 to 40% happier on holidays than on work days. So I don't think it's because we love work. The second quick one, what if you have a passion for your work? It's a lot better if you're working long hours that you have a passion for your work than if you hate it. But you can still get way out of balance. You can work like crazy on this stuff. Maybe 15, 20 years from now you don't have that passion. Maybe you'll lose your job. Maybe something else happens. And suddenly you look back and you say, oh, I had all that passion, but I never had time to make friends. I never had time to have hobbies. I never had time to have a family. So balance matters, and really that's the message of Bhutan, that when we calculate how to be happy in life, we have to look at all of these things.
Thanks. Well, I really want to echo John's answer to the first question, which is to say that I don't think it's cultural here so much as it is economic. And what's happened is the growth of employer power, the decline of unions, the growth of inequality, which is very closely connected with rising hours of work, and the structure of incentives in the economy that's been so important in that sort of different trajectory that the U.S. has taken relative to other countries, with the location of health insurance in the employment relation being really paramount there. To Manish's question about communication and is the importance of industriousness, I think, just to be a little bit controversial here, so the two of us are not just sitting here saying the same thing, which is dull, this may be a place in which we differ. 20 years ago, I wrote The Overworked American, and at that time, there was a lot of popular resonance for the idea of working less. And that was across the political spectrum. So you had conservatives who were concerned about the impacts of long working hours on the family, as well as people, more liberal and stuff, who had a variety of reasons that they were interested in and felt that we had a problem of too much work. Today, I think it's very hard to find people across any part of the spectrum who think we're working too much. And in fact, there's a mentality that has come up with neoliberal ideology and the rightward shift of views about the economy, that people generally think we need to work more and we need to be more efficient and so forth. And So you'll notice one difference in our two presentations. I talked about fewer hours of work in the formal sector, which freed people up for self-provisioning and other kinds of activities. So it was less about recreating, leisure, etc. John's presentation focused more on the need for leisure. It's not that I disagree that we need more leisure, but I think in terms of crafting a message, that one which talks about productive ways of spending time outside of work may be more rhetorically successful in the current period.
I want to say that I fully agree with Juliet about that and about the importance of self-provisioning. I think that is something that we can make possible in us, but especially we still need to think about this issue: how much can we grow, and how do we, in some ways, limit overall aggregate income so that we don't consume and buy more. So if people simply use free time from work, I believe in self-provisioning activities, but not necessarily ones that make money. I believe in the whole popular local gardening movement, where people are out doing those kind of things and sharing and so forth. I think that's absolutely essential. I also believe that we need time to be citizens, and that doesn't necessarily pay anything, but it's really important to be participatory in all of this, and we've lost that in the consumer world. We've lost what it means to be citizens. We also really need time to take care of our kids and our families and all of those other things. So while I'm not opposed to a little of that being used to make a little more money in a less formal way, I think if that were the purpose, that would be a mistake. And I think we need to say, we need time for its own sake.
Thank you, John, and we really want you to disagree, so continue on this road.
John and Julia. Peter Denton from Winnipeg in Canada. A couple of reflections on the importance of time here. I think we have to acknowledge the generational and cultural shifts in time use, especially in relationship to development of technology. You look at the amount of hours that are spent by younger generations on video games. I remember the shocking statistic when Halo 3 came out, and I'm going to use the term deliberately, there were 1 billion man-hours spent playing Halo 2. And all I could think of is if those 1 billion man-hours had been spent picking up trash, we'd have a clean planet. So that there is time. Everyone here will say we don't have the time for, but in terms of time management, we really do have time. We choose to spend it in certain ways and not others. So part of the time to do these things may already be there, but we're just spending it in other ways. And also the addition of new technologies, as you know, isn't necessarily the answer. When you look at the development of domestic technology in the early 20th century, more work for mother was the result of things like the invention of the washing machine, and that's been very clearly documented. So new technologies don't necessarily give us more leisure either. But in terms of, John and I have had this conversation already, to pick up on something that I asked Carol Graham about. I mean, I was going to ask John if he's happy and how he knows that, because I'm delighted to find out about that website, because I'm in the midst of preparing a proposal to speak to young people, and my title is You Can't Count Happiness. So are the two of you happy, and how do you know?
Before you answer, I take one or two more questions.
You want to answer?
He's going to take some more questions.
Oh, okay.
We'll answer that.
Sure.
Am I happy? Yes. Thank you, Juliet. I wanted to thank you for your presentation. We're certainly Nadia Roxy from Parsons and New School for Design. Parsons, Desis Lab, research, student work definitely connects with the shared economy, the self-provisioning, peer-to-peer. And students look at it from the offline and the online, the socio-technical side, obviously furthering and enabling all kinds of things. But I think what was interesting, and I wanted to know if you're addressing this or thinking about addressing it, were some of the bits that you said are going to be challenging in the research. And one of those areas that keeps coming to me, and I don't necessarily bring it up directly with the students at this point, but is to say we are putting the hands in the socio-technical systems. We're still reliant on the larger corporations that run those systems. And the more that those systems connect and rely on that, in some ways, aren't we just kind of shifting Again, not the equity, not the solidarity. Maybe there's some other structure that needs to be put into place in order to remove ourselves again from a different kind of hierarchy. Thanks.
One more question here.
It's not so much, Sue McGregor from Canada, pick up on something that Peter said. It's not so much a question, but instead of, I leave this with you, instead of thinking about the clock ticking down, and one time I got really sick and was depressed, and the person I was going to for counseling said, I want you to take 3 or 4 face cloths and go around your house and cover up the clocks in your house. It took me 15 to do it. I had no idea how I was marking time. No wonder I was going nuts and insane. I read this someplace, and it wasn't my idea. Instead of marking time, live your life in relationship with time and make it the essence in your life, not the thing that's driving your life. And it really helps you reframe this whole conversation. Don't lose track of the fact that we do, if you do the clock, we have limited time. If you don't do the clock, you can reframe it differently.
Thank you very much for this question. The floor is for Juliet and John in whatever order you want. And then we will take one more round of questions and we will wrap up.
You want to go first?
I'm not sure that I have an answer.
Okay. So on the last point, I think that's really important. At how we live in relationship to time is crucial. I think that also connects with the point about the video games. But I think for me, a crucial thing is that in an economy in which employers demand long hours, and that is increasingly what has happened in this economy, in which people who work for others have less and less control over their time, particularly as you move down the occupational ladder. One of the big ways in which people are economically exploited or oppressed is that they don't have control over their time, so they're subject to uncertain schedules and so on and so forth. I think that's the control of time is really key, and I think some of these attitudes about time and changing your attitude to time also require that you are not dependent on a job which is so all-consuming and exploitative in terms of time. The second question was from, I'm going to answer that. I'm doing that one last. What was the...
Just answer the question that you want to answer. That's okay.
No, I wanted to answer it, and I just can't remember it. So, okay, I'll start with, am I happy? I don't really care about happiness. To me, it's not really that important. For me, I'm much more interested in, am I leading a meaningful life? Does my life have purpose? Am I living in line with my values? And I think if I do that, happiness takes care of itself. It's one of the reasons I'm not so keen on the big shift towards discussing happiness. And that, all of the attention about happiness is something John and I have talked about before a little bit. I maybe haven't been so explicit about it. But I do think that it is a difference. To me, happiness comes out of utilitarianism and liberal philosophy, which I think is the wrong way to go. And I think it's antithetical to a more collective kind of approach to how to construct a good society. So I tend to be more in that camp.
Now we have a real discussion. Go on.
Okay. Yeah. Well, two things. These will be an answer to Peter's questions. In terms of the video games as one, I absolutely do believe that we also need education for leisure, how to use leisure. Parents have to have the time with their kids so that the kids aren't spending all the time doing that. One thing that we find internationally is that people tend to watch more television in countries where they work longer hours, so that statistically, we see the most television viewing in the Western world, in Japan, South Korea, the United States, the long hours countries, and the least television in the Netherlands, Norway, and so forth, the lowest, because television is in some ways, and all of this, an activity that you really want to do when you're burnt out. You get there and you come home from work and you're just exhausted, and I'm the same way. It's easy to click and be entertained. If you have a little more time, and we've seen this, I could go into this, but I won't, then people have more time to go out and spend time with others and socialize and do those things. Why is happiness important? Well, I don't think of happiness in terms of the hedonic thing or momentary pleasure, and I don't think that's the way Bhutan defines it. I think Bhutan is defining it very much in what Carol Graham talked about, the eudaimonic, the Aristotelian sense, and that's why they see it as being about balance of these activities and things in their lives, in people's lives, including very strong social connections and health and mental health. And mental health, really all the questions that Bhutan and others ask about mental health have to do with this: do you have a sense of purpose? Is there meaning in your life? Are you doing things that are important to you? So I think that we can have this conversation about happiness or well-being, and even those two terms certainly aren't exactly synonymous, but I think that it engages people in a conversation that begins to take us beyond GDP. It's not the only answer, but I think it's a very valuable dialogue, and what Bhutan is currently presenting to the United Nations, will be in 2014, I think is an amazing step forward in trying to move the world in a different direction, away from consumerism and toward connection.
Thank you both. You still agree with each other. The last brief round of questions. I have 3 speakers, and that will be it.
So I couldn't help but notice when Julia put up her slide and she was showing those houses that the self-provisioners built, that they were the most low material use, high energy efficiency kinds of houses that you could possibly build. And my mind flashed to my niece, who is taking a year off to refurbish a 3,500 square foot standard American house that she bought because of the crash. So it makes me wonder, how sure are we that if we had widespread self-provisioning, we would get desirable results? Might it not boomerang on us?
Thank you, John. Too many fingers, sorry. Please start.
So I have Graham Bullock from Davidson College. I have a policy-related question for both Juliet and John. First, I was glad you mentioned the healthcare insurance issue, and I'm curious about, because that seems to be a big barrier for people to take sort of part-time jobs, and it's also arguably, I know it's complicated, but it's arguably what a lot of large corporations like Walmart want you to do, take part-time job, then they don't have to pay for healthcare. And I'm curious what your impression of Obamacare is in terms of enabling sort of more part-time work lifestyles, self-provisioning. And then question for John is related to this idea of sort of unlimited vacation, which some companies, I think most notably Netflix, have implemented. And you were quoted in an article from a couple years ago in the Wall Street Journal about this phenomenon, but they didn't actually quote your opinion about it, so I'm curious what it is. For those of you who don't know, it's this idea that the company gives you doesn't count your vacation and focuses more on what you get done, and then you can take as much as you want. And I think there's a strategic reason behind it, which is they don't have to then have vacation hours on their books as a liability. So I'm curious what your impression of that policy is.
Thank you for the question. Last question.
Ellis Jones, Holy Cross. You know, there's something I've been struggling with for much of the conference, and I think it comes up here in this talk when we start to discuss issues of time, which I think is inherently one of the most quantifiable substances we have outside of money. And then we begin to talk about happiness and fulfillment, living with integrity, and social justice, climate change. And what I struggle with is exactly how do we resolve the tension between the need to quantify things that are important in the world, love and beauty, happiness, meaning, and fulfillment, in order to bring them into the world and make them real for the society, because the society likes the kind of hard numbers. right? As soon as you can put cost on something, then the society takes it seriously. As soon as you can quantify the time or the work time off, it takes it seriously. And yet, not fall under the kind of tyranny of measurement that you see with something like measuring the quality of a college or university. You end up with U.S. News and World Report rankings, and suddenly you have these colleges and universities all over the country that are just reshaping themselves to create these kind of numerically significant yet meaningless, ultimately, measures of something like quality. I'm just wondering where you two fall on that need to measure and quantify versus need to keep it away from quantification.
Thank you. Great question. The last round is for you too.
You want to start? Go ahead.
No, you can.
Quick answers. Let's take the last one first. I don't believe in measurement just as an end in itself, and I do believe that in the long run, we probably want a society where we have to do an awful lot less of it, whereas a society about gifting and about giving and all of that. I think in the short run, we need to change the dialogue by talking about starting to measure some things that matter more than the things that we're measuring. So I see it as a strategic thing. Now, can it go too far? I mean, some people say if you measure ecosystem services and all of those, the value of the earth, that maybe you're losing, the spiritual quality of the earth. Maybe. I mean, I think there's a fine line, and I would agree with that. But I do believe that starting to measure some of these things like looking at time and the kind of things that Bhutan is measuring as part of its system is a huge step forward from GDP and can move us in the right direction. About vacations and Netflix and so forth, I think there are a few companies that can do that. There are the companies that have professionals but a lot of jobs are for a long time going to be stationary jobs in place for people, and so that's harder to do. And I think we have to guarantee, I'm not less concerned about vacation time for the people who get lots of it, and more concerned for vacation time for the 30% of American workers who are also the poorest of American workers who don't get any time off and who are forced in these situations and who do not have this kind of time. The health effect of this is huge. We know that people who don't regularly take vacations are twice as likely to have heart attacks. If they're female, they're 2 to 8 times more likely to suffer from depression. I have a friend who's a heart surgeon who calls work stress the new tobacco and shows what it's doing to people all over. So I think we need to slow down in the ways that we can, and one of them is vacation. I'm sorry that I lose train of thought when there's several questions, so maybe you remember one of the others.
Yeah, and you may remember. And I realize Nadia walked out, and she's the one who asked the question that I couldn't remember before, but I'll email her an answer to her. So on Graham's question about the health insurance, I think it'll have a marginal, some positive impact, nothing like what a single-payer system would do or just expanding Medicare, because then you really can sever that link between employment. In Massachusetts, we still have large numbers of people covered through their employers, and those alternatives that exist outside of employment, it's certainly better than what we had before, but they're not. It's still, you still have to buy the insurance as an individual, and it's only if you have a really low income that you're eligible for the state provisioned Mass Health, which is excellent health care, but it's such a low income threshold that it's not really that applicable to people who may want to downshift out of a job into a part-time situation. But it's marginally better. I will end with John's question and say, which is sort of how do we know? And the first point is that I think, most of what we're seeing with this kind of DIY and self-provisioning activity is low footprint, in large part because it's the people doing it have that kind of a motivation. More generally, I think the answer to your question is no way we can know, because there's almost no way we can know about almost anything at the moment. I just think that the system has become really complicated, and the idea that we can make a change and we can predict all of its impacts, I think, is sort of less and less true these days. This is a conclusion I've come to somewhat reluctantly, because I definitely came out of a much more, an approach which really thought we have control and we have these policy levers, and sort of, a more typical modernist economist approach. So these days, if anyone asks me, how do you know X, I'm pretty likely to say, well, I don't. I think it's likely, but there are a lot of these unintended consequences that we're dealing with now.
Can I just finish up one on Graham's question about health care? I fully agree with Juliet that a single-payer system would make this much better for me. But what we have to understand in the United States is that the biggest problem is not necessarily health care, it's health. Think of health as a house, and think of health care as the roof of the house. Tremendously expensive in this country, but with 47 million holes in it for people who are uncovered. But the issue is, we could do health care the way everybody else does it, and we would still pay way more in the United States because we are so much less healthy. We live less longer, and if you grow up in the United States today, you have a 50% higher chance of suffering from heart disease, high blood pressure, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and arthritis than you would have after the age of 50 if you lived in Europe. That's huge, and that has an enormous effect, and part of that comes from the stress of our society. Part of that stress comes from overwork.
Right. So I think that we end up with more questions than we started with, so I want to remind Juliet, she just threw up a big question about how do we know that we make any progress, right? It is a real difficult thing in the system change. John and Juliet, thank you very, very much for your insights. We sketched just the first.
Thank you. That was fun. I'm glad when we mostly agree, but